Sounds like the ship had encountered some unknown force. Now, orders, counter orders, repeated urgent requests from the ship's computer records for anything concerning Star Trek Second Pilot, where no man had gone before.
Then let's talk about humans, about our frailties, and about the episode.
In this episode, we see two members of the USS Enterprise transform into godlike silvery-eyed espers. We journey with the Enterprise through the galactic barrier and then to the planet Delta Vega, and we see a bunch of Capharian apples be conjured up on the planet's surface.
Capharian apples.
How well do you think this episode is dated?
Well, I think that the drama of the episode holds up very well. It's very personal and human for everyone. I think where the episode is dated the most, aside from the visual effects, but that's to be expected for something of that age. Mitchell in particular comes across as, well, you wouldn't want him in your modern day workplace.
Improving the breed, Doctor. Is that your line?
I heard that's more your specialty, Commander. Line included.
Walking freezer unit.
He's a little loose in the way he talks to the ladies when he's on duty. Not a real professional, in that respect, which, is probably came across as a little more fun and lighthearted in the 60s, whereas today it seems like he'd be an HR nightmare.
I'm going to ask Dr. Dana to keep you under observation for a while.
With almost 100 women on board, you can do better than that, friend Captain.
I thought I found it notable, like Spock shouts in some of this episode.
Deflectors say there's something there. Sensors say there isn't.
And I think he's smiling like the first scene where you see him in.
Ah, yes. One of your Earth emotions.
Yeah, still not quite the Spock that we're used to. But a lot more Spock-like than, for instance, he was in The Cage. So they're coming a long way with that portrayal. And by the time you get to the Corbomite maneuver, he's just about fully formed.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I also thought that some of the music and the acting was a bit over-exaggerated.
Pray that you die easily.
Yeah, it was very dramatic. The 60s TV still had a lot of roots in like stage production. So everything's a lot stagier and sort of bigger.
All else a god needs compassion. Mitchell!
But too, I mean, people were watching it on, 12-inch screens at the time.
Screen on.
Screen on, sir.
So I think you had to be a little larger than life to get it across, whereas today we're watching on, I've got a 120-inch HD projector screen. So every little nuance comes across.
And on my monitor screen, I could see Mitchell smiling.
But so it does, you're right. It does seem a little larger than life, but, it's sort of just a product of the time.
The forerunner of a new and better kind of human being.
What did you think of the production aspects of this episode? For example, the costumes, sets, and phaser rifle.
The sets obviously are great, and they continue on to the series. The costumes, and for instance, like the phaser rifle, I think that even at the time, they realized that they could do better, because they did better.
I'm getting even better ideas here.
When the show went into production, the first thing they did was ditch the costumes. You don't see that phaser rifle again.
Not nearly as many after effects this time.
I think they're cool for the time, but, the turtlenecks look a little warm and uncomfortable to me. You wouldn't want to run around on a planet necessarily wearing a turtleneck sweater. But I think that, they're getting away from a bit of that sort of earlier than Star Trek sci-fi, that sort of Buck Rogers look, where they're trying to sort of nail down something that looks a little more functional, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I noticed like the front of the uniform, some of them look like really sort of tacked on.
Yeah, the zippers are a lot more apparent, and
yeah,
not everyone's uniform looks like it was tailored for them. you get a lot of people who look a little uncomfortable in their outfits.
I thought also like even like the color palette was a little bit like sort of more bland. I liked it when they introduced the red.
Right. Yeah, and if you want to sell color TVs, you need to get some bold colors on the screen. People need to get what they're paying for.
Yeah, I wasn't entirely keen on the sort of backdrop they used in this episode, and in The Cage they used it for Talos 4.
Okay, so you don't like the matte paintings?
I like the matte paintings, But yeah, I wasn't like so keen on that. It may have looked more authentic if they shot outdoors.
Sure, yeah. Even though instead of being on a set.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. But then if you're shooting outdoors, particularly at that time, it's just gonna look like Earth.
They did use it
Go
for
ahead.
like later planets, like in Arena and stuff like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Shooting out at Vasquez rocks and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I think that the matte painting's pretty effective. For the at the time they couldn't do digital environments or anything like that. So I think it's pretty clever to have the painting and then you sort of insert them into the painting for the long shot, and then you sort of setting everyone's imagination that they're out on this alien planet. But at the time, they're having to come up with ways to portray these stories, and I think they do it pretty effectively. You're right that the sort of landscape where he fights Mitchell just sort of feels like the foam rocks in a cyclorama. You don't have that real world feel like when he's fighting the Gorn, at Vasquez rocks. You're right about that. It does feel a lot more stagey.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite lines of dialogue from this episode?
Yeah, well, basically anything Spock says, I love. Especially when he says that, when Kirk asks him,
What makes you right and a trained psychiatrist wrong?
And Spock responds,
Because she feels. I don't.
He's just looking at the math of it. They're not going to make it to an Earth base with Mitchell on the ship.
We'll never reach an Earth base with him aboard, Jim.
So logically, you've got to find the solution to that. And the solution to that is get rid of Mitchell.
All I know is logic. In my opinion, we'll be lucky if we can repair this ship and get away in time.
And we know now that Spock feels, but at the time, audiences wouldn't necessarily have known all the ins and outs of who Spock was and that he's suppressing emotion rather than not having any.
Will you try for one moment to feel? At least act like you've got a heart. We're talking about Gary.
It's just the math problem and the
But
solution.
he does say at the end of the episode, I felt for him too.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I believe there's some hope for you after all, Mr. Spock.
I think the dialogue is great. And Samuel A. Peoples didn't write another episode of the show. He wrote an episode for the animated series, but I think he's a fantastic writer.
I've noted down some lines of like when Mitchell says,
You fools soon I'll squash you like insects.
Yeah, Mitchell doesn't take much time at all to think a lot of himself.
It'd take almost a miracle to survive here.
Well, then I shall make one.
Yeah. And also when Kirk says to Danner,
Nobody but us chickens, Doctor.
Right.
whose performance in this episode impressed you the most?
Well, I'll say William Shatner, because this is his first time at bat playing Captain Kirk. And to me, he just basically steps on the stage as Captain Kirk. And, there's not a big learning curve for him of figuring out how to be Captain Kirk. He just is. And I think he does a great job, and they give him a lot of material here because he's being asked should he kill his best friend to save his crew?
That doesn't seem very friendly.
And that's, as drama goes, that's pretty dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought the introduction to this episode, I think it's really quite amazing because it seems to establish like so much in so little time.
Right.
Like you've got like the captain's log first of all, and then like the introduction of Kirk, the difference where an emotionality with Spock and the fact he's a master chess player. So yeah, I thought a lot is established straight off the bat. Certainly.
Absolutely. And in that first scene too, when he's playing chess, you establish he's a master chess player, but he's not infallible because Kirk's beating him.
He played most illogically. His next move should have been the rook.
And that plays out later that he's, whether Spock's right or not about killing Mitchell, that we've already seen that his way isn't necessarily the best way, even if it makes sense.
It is the only possible way to get Mitchell off this ship.
So yeah, I think that you're right, in a very short period of time established that. And for a pilot, now this didn't air first, but they have to assume that someone watching this hasn't seen Star Trek before, and you're introducing this world to them, in just a few pages of dialogue.
Mm-hmm. How do you account for the R initial in Kirk's tombstone? Do you have a headcanon reason why you think it might be there?
Well, we know the real reason because they changed his middle name.
James Tiberius Kirk.
But I like to think that it's just a mistake that Mitchell made, that he thinks he's infallible, but right there on the tombstone, he gets Kirk's middle initial wrong.
He deserves a decent burial, at least.
Mitchell's not infallible. He's not this perfect God being that he thinks he is, that he does make just human errors.
God. It's still driven by human frailty.
What do you think?
I think that's really a cool way to look at it. I was thinking maybe you could say someone interfered, like Tulane or the Q or whatever.
Well, I've got some questions for you as well.
We'll move out into our probe as soon as we have those answers.
How did you feel about the portrayal of the Kirk-Mitchell relationship?
I really like how it has roots long before the episodes harken back to Kirk's academy days.
Hey, man, I remember you back at the academy. A stack of books with legs. The first thing I ever heard from an upperclassman was, watch out for Lieutenant Kirk. In his class, you either think or sink.
I think it was cool to give him that bit of backstory in the second pilot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something in the first pilot as well, where when you meet the crew, they're already post-adventure in the cage. They've got bandages and sprained ankles, and they're dealing with traumas from the previous adventure that we never saw. And the same sort of thing here, where you meet Kirk and Mitchell, and they've already got this history and backstory.
My friend, James Kirk. Remember those rodent things on Dimmerus? The poison darts they threw? I took one meant for you.
And almost died. I remember.
I think it's common in modern TV shows that everyone meets each other on the first day of the episode.
Hello, Jim.
You know, everyone's sort of shaking hands and getting to know each other as the show is starting. Whereas back in the day, you sort of just picked it up like it was just the next adventure. And, you know, you catch up as you go along.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. I didn't realize that was sort of like a done thing. But I was thinking how it sort of left room for then, even though obviously it's an alternate timeline, the writing of Star Trek 2009, where they realized, well, they've never done an introduction stories to these characters as such.
Right.
So,
yeah.
You at least want to know my name before you completely reject me?
I'm fine without it.
You are fine without it. It's Jim Kirk. If you don't tell me your name, I'm going to have to make one up.
It's Uhura.
Uhura? No way. That's the name I was going to make up for you.
And who knows, with the way they're producing shows now, we may eventually get a Prime Universe introduction of Kirk and Mitchell and whomever else. I think there's a lot of possibilities out there for those characters. I always kind of imagine that, this is different from what they did in 2009, but I would imagine that Kirk would have been a commander of a smaller vessel at some point. And I would have liked to have seen characters like Mitchell and Kelso as his crew on that before getting the big promotion to the Enterprise and bringing his guys with him.
Gary told me that you've been friends since he joined the service, that you asked for him aboard your first command.
And then sort of losing those guys early in the adventures.
So like maybe on the Farragut or something like that.
Maybe on the Farragut, but I think of the Farragut as being a Constitution class ship. But I would imagine Kirk as a commander of like a small destroyer class type ship, something with, a crew of 40 people working with him, kind of JFK-ish when he with his little PT ship, where he's got his little crew in a little ship and does well and gets promotion to the big ship. But, I guess we'll see what they do, if they do it.
Yeah, I was thinking I probably would have liked if there had been sort of more backstory to the Denner.
This is Dr. Dana, who joined the ship at the Aldebaran colony.
In the cage, similarly, I thought if they'd shown the crash that Vina was involved in.
They found me in the wreckage, dying. Lump of flesh.
Yeah.
I thought that would have been cool. I couldn't see really how they could have done that effectively with like the technology at hand, like the visual effects and stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking, that I don't know how they would on a TV budget. Now, if they had expanded the cage like they did some other 60s TV shows into a film, I think the cage could have been expanded into a film very well, and they could have beefed up the visual effects there and had a pretty good little Star Trek movie to put out in theaters. I wish they would have done that, but they obviously did not.
Yeah, they basically adapted it into the Menagerie two-parter later.
That's right. Well, would you have liked to have seen any of the one-off characters from this episode continue on as regulars in the series?
Yeah, I really liked the character of Dr. Piper.
Perfect.
And he's actually like my favorite doctor between him and Boyce, who's the doctor in the cage, and McCoy.
Dr. Piper.
I want only one medical officer here at any one time.
Well, I actually prefer Piper over McCoy.
If you're gonna get nasty, I'm gonna leave.
And I also think Alden, the communications officer, was really kind of cool as well.
You ready, Mr. Alden? Acknowledge, Mr. Mitchell.
I think you're the first person who's ever told me he prefers Dr. Piper over Dr. McCoy. Why is that?
I think he's sort of like less cantankerous.
That's interesting. Like Kelso and Mitchell, I would have liked to have seen more of those two guys. I think that they had a cool dynamic.
I was on my coffee break. I thought I'd check up on you.
Yeah. That's okay, Lee. Come on in. Don't let the light in my eyes bother you, pal. It's all for our good-looking lady doctor here.
Yeah, sure.
And I kind of like the idea of Kirk having some buddies. I mean, he's got, Spock and Bones, obviously, and the characters that we're familiar with. But these guys seem more like they have a history with Kirk from before he was the captain, where he was sort of one of the guys. And I think that would have been an interesting dynamic to play off of, too, if, they hadn't all died.
Oh, that's interesting.
How did you like the introduction of Scotty and Sulu in their first performances in Star Trek?
Astrocytes is standing by, Captain.
Engineering division ready, as always.
I thought they seemed a bit underused, but I like how Kirk gives a quick, broad smile when he's introduced first to Scotty. And it's interesting, I thought, how Sulu changed from being a physicist to a helmsman in the series proper.
That is like having a penny, doubling it every day. In a month, you'll be a millionaire.
I also like when Scott commends Kelso playing sort of a mentor role.
You're a talented thief, Kelso. Everything you sent up seems to be fitting in place.
And I find it interesting that Scott is actually manning the helm console at the end of the episode.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, Scotty should be more than capable of piloting the ship,
Yeah, well, he takes the command chair in some episodes, so
yeah,
sure.
Yeah. Everyone's role in the ship was a little less defined at that time. Obviously Sulu, but even Scotty, they're just sort of, it seems like they're sort of the background guys. Then obviously they become more prominent as the show goes on. And, now they're iconic characters. But it's interesting to see those guys as just, oh, here's the crew and the engineer. And you're like, oh, well, yeah, I know him. I think he's going to do well.
Yeah.
Well, how effective do you think the visual effects were?
Well, I definitely prefer the remastered effects, and I really like the look of the galactic barrier in that version.
Yeah, I think they did a good job with revisualizing the galactic barrier. That's one of the things that didn't quite work on the original version. Now, I'm a sucker for the old matte painting, so I love the old matte painting effect. But I think this is the second Star Trek episode ever made, and I think they doing a good job. A lot of the visual language that they still use now on Star Trek was established at that time. With the way the ships move. Even today, they're designing new Star Trek ships, and it's based on the original elements from that original design work. And I think it's for being 1965 when this was made, they're doing a bang up job. You compare it to other science fiction of the time on television, and I think it's head and shoulders above it.
I think it would have been cool if they'd actually shown the Valiant.
The only fact we have for sure is that the SS Valiant was destroyed.
Yeah. Now I do like the little design of that little buoy they beam on board.
Old-style ship recorder. They could be ejected when something threatened the ship.
And the little beep, beep, beep it does.
It's begun transmitting, sir.
You could drop that, probably because it's already beat up and weathered, and that's sort of what they do in sci-fi now. But I think you could drop that onto a show today, and it wouldn't look terribly out of place.
I suppose all these things, like I'm saying, like it would have been cool if they'd shown like the crash, and it would have been cool if they'd shown the Valiant. It's all like more work, I suppose, for them. I suppose they would have had like so much to contend with already without like these aspects. And I don't know, they may have thought like, let's give the audience, the viewers, like something sort of to imagine where you're not like pointing out everything,
Yeah. Well, at the time too, they were, every penny mattered, when they're having to make the shows, and if they didn't have to show something, they weren't going to show it. But yeah, I think that it would have been cool to see things like the ship crashing in the cage, or the Valiant, or just more of the Star Trek world around them. But I think they're very specific in what they do show and where they do put their time and money in. And I think it pays off, because where they are able to put it is into the story. And I think the story is great.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So who do you think was right about killing Mitchell? Do you think Spock was right? He needed to be killed, or do you think Kirk could have got away with just leaving him behind?
I think it's a difficult decision to make, but I think Spock was ultimately right, as Kirk finds that the only really viable solution was to kill Mitchell, even though he briefly loses the silvery look in his eyes, and even though Denner comes across as more apologetic and compassionate than Mitchell.
I'm sorry. You can't know what it's like to be almost a god.
Yeah, definitely Mitchell ended up not leaving him with much of a choice in the end. But yeah, it's a tough one, because you try to imagine like killing your best friend or anyone else that you care about for the good of everyone else. And that's a tough thing to wrap your head around. But I think they do a good job in the episode.
Morals are for men, not gods.
It's a good moral dilemma, which is what Star Trek does best, I think. It's if it was just killing the bad guy, that's not as interesting as, you know, the bad guy is someone that everyone cares about and you don't want to kill. I think that makes it a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
It wasn't that bad.
Thank you for joining me today.
And no problem at all. Thanks for having me.
Hit the like and subscribe buttons and join us next time as we discuss the Cormorant maneuver. Helmsman, take us out of here. Track you later.